We know that if the world goes into Niger right now, millions of people, thousands of people are gonna die. Civilians, military, it's gonna be a colossal loss of lives. In June 2023, President Ruto of Kenya made a cry to the global world at the Finance Global Summit, asking for equity for Africa. Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa made a similar cry, asking for equity. Africa wants to play at the table, at the global table. I am all against coups, but what we see happening in Niger today is another form of a group of people asking for equity for Africa, for the continent. It is one time in the world in Africa where we are not divided, but we stand together. Every different country articulating its ask for equity, articulating its ask for independence, to play by itself at a global table, to be able to liberate its people into a world of better things. Africa has gone through a lot for so many years, despite all of its wealth, struggling to feed itself, begging at the table of giants. Like I said, I am totally against coups, and I do not stand or support for what is happening in the military. But what I do know is that we are at a precipice in time where we need to do something decisive. This will never happen again, but it's happened right now, and the question is, now that we are here, what are we going to do about it? The head of the ECOWAS initially wanted to send an army out there, wage war against Niger, right? And then he decided to send an envoy out there. And the envoy did not succeed, right? We all know that the envoy was only received by representatives. Now, what do we do from here? How do we make sure that there is peace in the continent? And how do we make sure that the voices of the people of Niger is still being heard by the global world? I know a lot of people are thinking about what to do, but here are my thoughts on what I think we need to do in 5 points. The first thing I think is, right now, nobody in Niger, the military that has taken power, Abdurrahman and team, they're not speaking. As a matter of fact, there is no communication out from Niger. Everything we see on social media is because people are saying this is why they're doing it. They're fighting because they want their resources back. The terrorists were found at some point and they were not allowed to eliminate them. This is not them speaking. This is different people on social media springing together thoughts for them. I think that they need a communication strategist, right? Somebody that can speak on their behalf. Why are we doing this? What is the proof for what we're doing this? And they need to create that support for themselves by speaking out. As a matter of fact, just a day ago, right, the president that is captured by the Guptas, right, by the military, he's given out a whole speech talking about why he needs to be rescued by the US, by the West. He's talking in captivity, but the guys that have held him captive are not speaking. If you do not take control of the narrative and put your position out there, you will be totally dominated and dictated over. So this is what they need to do. They need to speak. They need to talk about the whys. They need to talk about the proof points. They need to, first of all, also talk about why are they doing this? What do they want? What are the next steps? It's not enough to take power, right? But what are you doing? What's the next step? They need a communication strategist. Almost like what we saw happen in Ethiopia, right? Ethiopia took charge because they were speaking. The world was trying to create a narrative, but they created their own narrative, right? And that's what Niger needs to do at this point, right? So they need a communication strategist, right? The second thing that I think that is so important right now is they need to be able to show what is required for the greater good, right? Now, what we need right now is not a war. I've seen the press release out there from the president, Mohamed Bazoum, saying that the world should rescue him. We know that if the world goes into Niger right now, millions of people, thousands of people are going to die. Civilians, military, it's going to be a colossal loss of lives. The last thing we need right now from any leader is asking for anybody to come and rescue him. I think this is the point where leaders need to put away ego, put away self, and think about what is required for the greater good of Niger, what is required for the greater good of French West Africa, what is required for the greater good of Africa. Now, I think personally that the trust that Mohamed Bazoum, the president of Niger, has in his people has been lost. The people do not trust him anymore. This is when Mohamed needs to say, how do I handle this so that the greater good does not suffer? I think that he needs to resign. This is the point where President Mohamed of Niger needs to realize that he has lost the trust of the people, and to save the lives of thousands of millions, he needs to hand over power. People do not believe that his mouthpiece is the mouthpiece of Niger. They think that it's the mouthpiece of the West, of France, of the US, so he's lost that trust. The greatest thing he can do at this point is to resign for the sake and to prevent the loss of lives. And then I think there needs to be the voice of somebody that can be trusted, right? That is the middleman, right? That the West respects, that the national people in Niger respects. It needs to be somebody that is respected by all parties. That the ECOWAS respects, that AU respects. But it definitely cannot be a voice that maybe just one part of the world, respects. And by the way, there is no leader that would ever want the loss of the lives of his people. If a leader is calling for war at this point, then there's a problem. He's thinking more about self than about the people of his country. And that is not the right thing to do. Number two, this is not a war for Niger. This is not a war for French West Africa. It's a war, or it's a position that must be taken by Africa. I think this is the point where Niger needs to be able to pull together Africans, right? To make a narrative where Africa speaks up for them. Where the leaders cannot speak politically correctly or speak confidently, how do we raise up the voice of the people in Africa? Now, the greatest curse we have ever had is we have always stood apart. When Libya was fighting its war, different countries were doing different things. Citizens were in one space. Now we sit in a space when we say, if we had known, we would have stood together and supported or prevented what happened in Libya, to Mohamed Gaddafi at that point. But that is us looking backwards, right? If we stood at a point where in Uganda, where Idi Amin was being brought down, and people think about it at this point, should we have raised our voices together at that point instead of leaving it to Uganda alone at that point? In Europe and in different parts of the world, we've been able to amass one big voice, right, where Europe can speak together, but Africa never speaks together. This is one point where Africans need to realize that this is not about Niger, this is about us, right? We didn't speak up for DRC, we didn't speak up for Libya, we didn't speak up for Zimbabwe, we didn't speak up for Uganda. How do we speak up for what is happening in French West Africa? Almost as passionately as we would speak up for elections in our country. This is where the obedient in Nigeria need to come out. And we need the right people to speak up at this point. This is the point where PLO, Reno, all of those guys that always speak when the war is over, right? It's always easier connecting the dots looking back. This is one point where you need to be able to play. You can't be a stooge and talk. You need to come to the table. What are you gonna do? What's gonna be your play? Don't talk about it when it's over. You don't talk about this when the war is over, right? It's easier when you do that. You need to strategically play at the table right now. This is the time. This is when influencers can talk. It's not when it's over, right? This is when influencers, right? If you're an influencer, you need to speak up right now. This is your time, right? What your leaders cannot do because they need to be politically correct, you can do it. The fourth thing that I think that is so important that we must do is, I always see people riot, right? People carry placards, people carry billboards, and they go out there all fighting, right? And the one thing that we never know sometimes is, what do they want? What is the narrative? Somebody needs to string together a structure, right? What do we want? What's the narrative in 1 month? What do we want to see in French West Africa? Do we want the terms reversed? Do we want the prices reversed? And what is the strategy? If we are against what is happening right now, what strategy do we want to put in place? And we need somebody to write that book, right? And it needs to be clear. Now, finally, and most importantly, I do not think that anybody has to be afraid. Africa's probably got more at risk in this. One body that must not be scared, and I really wish that maybe my voice was enough, but there is nothing for the West to be afraid of, right? There is nothing for any country, there is nothing for the West, for France to be afraid of, because the lives of its people, they're being extracted, right? No, lives have not been lost. What we have lost right now is buildings. Glasses have been broken, windows have been damaged, buildings have been burned, flags have been done. At this point, It is still ego that has been bruised. But there is nothing to be scared about from a human life perspective. There is the worry about security, about resources, and the fluidity of how that will come back into the West, right? But there is nothing to be afraid of. There is nothing that says that anybody needs to be attacked tomorrow. There is no war that is required because there is nothing at imminent risk right now. The people of Niger are safe. There is nobody that is being harmed. No president is being murdered. Nobody is being killed. The leaders are being held until a position where things can be clear. It's not a point to react and jump. Nobody needs to be afraid. What, however, needs to be thought about is maybe there were benefits of things that the West was getting, and it might not be as easy as that in the future. Now, the reality is, how do you drive equity at the table? Africa is not asking for, we need people to buy these things. The resources, we don't have the factories to be able to mine these things, to be able to create them, at least not right now. So we're definitely going to need a market of people that can buy it, but at the right terms, at the right table. There is no reason to be afraid. I mean, if the market is perfect, in a totally competitive environment, I really don't understand why anybody needs to be scared. This is that point in 1945, right? This is that Brentwood opportunity where people can sit at the table and say, what does this look like? What does the future look like? How is it going to be renegotiated, with the right people, with the right minds, with the right terms? And this, by the way, is what President Ruto said in a really great environment, right? How do you have another Brentwood? We're at a point right now in 2023 where we have Africans that have never been as wise as they've been, never been as outspoken as they've been, never been in a position to actually sit at the table and drive things that can be equitable, not just for Africa, but for the full continent of the world. If Africa was great, nobody would try to go into nations, right? The UK is facing a position where they're trying to extradite or get out people that are crossing with ships, because they're looking for a better country. If things were better here, that would be an agenda that, is totally off the table. What's happening in Spain, all of that stuff. I think we need to see the bigger picture here. If there's an Africa that is bigger and better, the world's problems would be really solved, by a large degree. This is happening because of the pains of the people and because they want to sit at the table. Not to kill the West, not to bring anybody down, but to make things better for the entire world, for themselves and for the entire world. And I think we need to see it that way, right? We don't want a war, nobody needs to go to fight, but these 5 points, if Niger would put them in place, we'll be in a position where we can move right into the next space. The worst thing that can happen is for an agenda to tear us apart. When that happens and the AU is singing a song, ECOWAS is singing another song, and the French West Africa region is singing another song, we are totally divided. We cannot stand apart. We are better when we stand together. And whatever that means in your language, whether it's Swahili, whether it's Yoruba, Hausa, whether it's French, standing together, translate that into your language. And when you hear it in your language, you think about it. It's we stand together for the future of Africa. Africa is rising, and Africa can rise.